Hello and welcome to this preview video of the beginning, the first 192 lines of Maria Headley's translation of Beowulf. Just a proviso, the pattern of how I do these videos is that I preview a chunk of text, reading some highlighted portions, and the hope, I do that first, and the hope is that people that are new to the text can sort of mark up their books, get a sense of maybe the sort of obvious things that matter, and maybe have some things in the margins of their books and some underlines or highlights so that when you go and experience the book, you're already sort of grounded in it. Particularly early on in a text like Beowulf, I think this is helpful. If halfway through you want to just launch into the reading and listening first and then maybe get some notes after, that makes sense. But I think it's good to tune our ears to this new kind of text by getting some guidance first and then experiencing the poem. Also, something unique to Headley's translation, and she has a variety of explanations and reasons for doing this, is that there is some profanity. And I'm teaching this to seniors who are pretty much 18 years old. If I was teaching Beowulf to younger kids, not that the F word is a novelty to people that are 15 or 16, but I think it's a different conversation. I'm fine with doing this with 18-year-olds, but that's a personal decision for all of you who are reading the text or teaching it. So the first 192 lines of Headley's translation I entitle Family History and the Wrath of an Outsider. So I think one of the most exciting things, we can look at it as a burden or as an adventure, is when you start a new text, particularly a great new text for us that's an older text, so a new text to us but an older text. We immediately realize that each literary text has its own rules of the road, its own rules for operation, its own rules for reading. So we learn early on in Beowulf that it begins with a lineage. And just like in the Bible, like in the Gospel of Matthew, you can get really bored, so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. But I think, to be a good nuanced reader, always ask the question, what is this doing here, right? Why does it matter that we know if the initial lineage lands on someone? Why, in Matthew, that would be Jesus, right? And in Beowulf, it's a character named Hrothgar. Why is it important that we learn all these things about them? Why bother doing that? So that's actually a good conversation. I would say take the things early on that seem like problems or contradictions or things that are confusing and talk about them. And the default setting can be, what is this doing here? Right? Well, how is this behaving in the poem? Okay. So I start all of my classes with the poem, and for the first time in these videos, I'm actually going to include what those poems are going to be, and they're often sort of thematically connected to the reading of the day. Yusuf Kumenyako, who's a professor of poetry at Princeton, is one of my favorite contemporary poems. This is his most famous and anthologized poem, and it's called Facing It, which is about a veteran going to look at the Vietnam Wall again. So you can get this lots of places on YouTube. Okay, first, some points about what stands out about the narrator, the speaker of this poem, and the lineage that begins the poem. So here are just some things that might be worth marking up in your margin. First, lots of ink is spilt on how different translators of Beowulf translate the first word. The first word of Beowulf in Anglo-Saxon is hwat, and it's an attention-getting word. Literally, it means attend, hark. So it doesn't mean so. Haney was crazy translating it that way. It's an attention-getting word that's meant to remind us that this poem isn't a polite text read in an easy chair. This is a performance piece read for warriors. And if warriors are gathering, you'd have to get their attention before starting a poem, and this is what this word meant. Hark, be quiet, right? Listen. Headley, I think, interestingly translate that as bro, right? Reminding us of the inherent sort of masculinity of the context of the beginning of the poem. And also that's a contemporary attention-getting word. So this is a sort of chorus of the entire poem Beowulf. And this is what the phrase looks like. Thought was good kuning. That was a good king, right? All those words are sort of cognates, right? They're very familiar to us. Thought was good kuning. And in line 11 of the, if you look at the first page of the poem here, we get a story of Shield Sheving, who's a descendant or who's in the lineage of Hrothgar. And for lots of reasons, he's called a good king. So I would circle line 11. That was a good king. And then maybe in the margin write why. That's a good thing to talk about. How is this poem defining one of its most important terms? Good king. And something to put under your hat is the definition of a good king different at the end of Beowulf as it is in the beginning? And then there's 4 kings that are mentioned in the beginning of the poem. So line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the beginning of that second little paragraph on page 3, you have Shield Shefing. Circle that. That's the first guy that's mentioned there. Okay? Then we get Beow, who's on the next page, line 17. Circle him. Okay? We get a description of him. Then we get a king called Halfdane. He's on page 5, and he's in line 55 or so. Circle him. Circle Halfdane. And then, last but not least, all of these pages and all of these lineage, all of this lineage lands on page 6, the first big stanza, a few lines from the top of page 6, the last king mentioned, Hrothgar. What we're getting here is a lineage that lands on the current king of Denmark, the current Danish king, Hrothgar. But I want to point out, rather than just look at this sort of as the non-exciting parts of this great story, let's look at what makes each of these kings interesting and maybe ask the question as the poem goes on. Why does the initial lineage of a poem called Beowulf end with not Beowulf, end with Hrothgar? Okay, I want this t-shirt. I should just get it. We meet Grendel on page 7, and I would just write, again, particularly if you're a novice reader to this kind of poetry, somewhere on the top of page 7, you can write Intro to Grendel. Intro to Grendel. These are little markers that can help you read this book for the first time, or for not the first time. And I'm going to point out a few things that might be worth thinking about further that are interesting to Grendel. First, we learn almost right away what bothers him. And it starts in line 90, line 89 actually. Their poetry, the poetry of Hrothgar's men, poison Grendel's peace. What an interesting thing to bother him. And then what is the poetry? The poetry is the creation story. It's in italics on page 7. The Almighty made earth for us, sun and moon for our delight. And this is an echo of the very first known poem in Anglo-Saxon. And it's called Caedmon's Hymn. And I won't get down a rabbit hole here, but Caedmon was an illiterate monk who, whenever the monks were telling stories, he would always become shy and not tell stories. And then God spoke to him in a dream saying, sing for me, Caedmon. And the illiterate monk said, what do I sing? And God said, sing of my creation. And this is the actual Anglo-Saxon poem that Caedmon sang, and he became very famous. Nu schulan herian, helfen riches werd, methodes mechta, und des mod jethank. So this is what the Anglo-Saxon looked and sounded like. Singing of the kingdom of heaven's guardian or ward, the measurer's might. So measurer is a word for God. And his mind purpose, his mind think, his modjethank. Work of the wonder father, werk wulder father. So This is what bothers Grendel. Not just singing itself, but singing of God's creation. We learn why in a while. And then go to line 120. We get what Grendel does when he's bothered. Right around line 120, Grendel hurt and so he hunted. I think that's an interesting line. This stranger taught the Danes about time. So Grendel's bothered by the song of God's creation, and I guess the community that he senses singing the song together in a glorious mead hall. So that bothers him. And he ends up going on a murderous rampage because he hears this communal connection. It makes for a really interesting villain. So if you go back to line 101, we never hear Grendel speak, but we know so much about him. Line 101, Grendel was the name of this woe walker. And we learn that he's in the line of Cain. So I would bracket that entire bottom stanza on page 7. And we know that Cain is the father of modern weapons, the father of murder, the father of fratricide. He kills the one he's supposed to be closest to. So Cain, in an Anglo-Saxon context where you were supposed to be incredibly loyal to your family and to your fellow warriors because that kept you safe, Cain would represent the greatest of evils. And that's who Grendel is genetically connected to. So that adds a layer of scariness to him. If you go to line 163 and 164, we even see how Grendel fights. Grendel, enemy to everyone, waged his war without an army, lonesome as he lapped the luxurious lengths of Heorot. He fights at night by himself. So there's an interesting Anglo-Saxon word, wrecca, W-R-A-E-C-C-A, I think. And we get our word wretched from that. And it's the worst thing you can be in an Anglo-Saxon context. It's being wretched, being utterly alone, which means you were doomed. Tolkien, in his notes for Beowulf, says it's actually also could be, wrecca could also be defined as hero, because if you could survive and succeed alone, you were incredibly heroic. So I think Grendel's complicated. I don't think Grendel is a stick figure villain whatsoever. And then some other layers of evil that are interesting. If you go to line 152 on the bottom of page 9, it says, Grendel was broken and would not brook peace. Anything I read aloud, I tell my students, mark in your book. Grendel was broken and would not brook peace, desist in dealing deaths, or die himself. In my early video with Anglo-Saxon terms, I mentioned the term weregild, man price, a way that this society maintained relative peace. And if you in my village or in a separate village kill one of my family, you have to pay me the death price, the man price, weregild. And the threat of weregild meant there hopefully wasn't more violence than there already was. Grendel doesn't play by the rules of society. He doesn't pay for the nightly murders that he ravages upon Heorot and upon Hrothgar's men. So that's another layer of evil of Grendel. Line 158, 159. This is something Haney does well that I'm not sure I like how Headley does it, but that's fine. Line 157, it says, be it wizened vizier or beardless boy, Grendel hunted them across foggy moors, an owl. She talks about Grendel as an owl mist diving for mice. The original is Dark Death Shadow. I think it's dark, I forget with death, but all those words look like cognates in the original, and she creates a sort of animalistic image instead. But Grendel is a dark death shadow. So he operates in the dark in a surprising way. He doesn't play by the rules of society. And then an interesting, quirky thing, if you go to 168, it says, Grendel couldn't touch the treasure, in Heorot, in the mead hall, or tame his yearning, for he had been spurned by God. What he couldn't touch wasn't so much the treasure, but was the seat of gifts, the gift stool, the gift stole, the seat that Hrothgar would sit on. And if any of his men were loyal or fought particularly heroically, he would dispense gifts to them, and that would create a relationship where they would be rewarded for their loyalty. And the more men that were heroic and loyal, the safer they were, right? Interestingly, in Old English, early English baptismal ceremonies, this is the word for the priest's altar also, because the pagan gifts of, jewels and chalices and shields and swords transmogrified into modern Christianity as the greatest gift, which is Christ himself in the Eucharist. So that's just a little nugget. And whether you look at it from the new Christian point of view, or in the case of just, pagan Anglo-Saxonism, there was almost like a God-created force field around the seat of gifts. And no matter how much destruction Grendel thrust on Hrothgar's men, he couldn't approach the gift seat. So that's really, really interesting. So I just want to close here by asking you, what else do you notice in the first 192 lines about either the story of Hrothgar's men, his lineage, or Hrothgar himself, or about Grendel? I am very much skimming over the surface of a lot of the nuance here. But anyway, hopefully this video helps you enter into this poem in a thoughtful way, in a way that's engaging, in a way that encourages your questions. Good luck with your reading.